2 hours before dawn, the limestone country lay silent beneath a cloud cover thick enough to swallow the moon. Then the ground began to tremble. 9 shapes pulled loose from the dark along the north road, spread wide. Each beat of hooves measured, even planned long before this night. A copper bell rang soft in the dry creek bed. A horse stumbled. A curse swallowed low in a man's throat. In the dark yard, a door opened. A woman stepped down off the porch, alone. Unarmed behind her, an old man's trembling hands raised a rifle. From the barn loft, another barrel waited in silence. 9 armed riders, 5 souls. And 30 feet beneath the soil, something worth more than every life standing in that yard tonight. She should have stepped back. She stepped forward. The letter found her on a Tuesday morning above the dry goods store in Comanche County. Slipped under her door by the boy who ran the post office route, and Margaret Hollis knew, before she'd broken the seal, that something in it would change the shape of her week, because Walter Coombs did not write letters lightly. He had never been a man who spent words he didn't need to spend. 4 lines. When they came from him, carried the weight of 40. She read them standing, coffee cooling untouched, on the small table by the window, and by the 3rd line her hands had gone, still in a way she recognized from long practice, the particular quiet that settled over her whenever something asked more of her than ordinary correspondence. His heart had turned on him through the winter. He'd spent 3 weeks unable to rise from bed except for meals, and even now, writing this, his hand wasn't steady enough to make the letters come out the way they used to. He needed someone to watch over the ranch while he mended, someone he trusted to know the difference between a problem worth worrying over and one that would solve itself. He could pay $15 a month and offer a room, and he understood it wasn't much, and he was sorry for that, and he hoped she'd consider it anyway, because he genuinely did not know who else to ask. He hadn't explained why her name, out of every capable person in 3 counties, had risen to the top of his thinking. He didn't need to. Margaret understood the calculus without it being spelled out. She had spent 30 years married to a county judge, sitting close enough to his bench to absorb, almost by accident, an education most women of her generation never received. How to read a man's intentions underneath his words. How to tell which fears deserved attention and which were simply noise dressed up as urgency. How to sit with a problem until its true shape emerged from whatever camouflage had been built around it. She set the letter down and looked around the small room that had been her whole world for 18 months, since she'd sold the houses in town, because its rooms had grown too large for the silence that lived in them now. Joseph had been gone that long, and the grief had settled from something sharp into something more like weather, present but no longer cutting, and the work she did now, taking in piecework sewing for the dry goods store downstairs, asked nothing of the parts of her mind that had once been so thoroughly occupied. She had told herself, in the early months, that the rest would do her good. She had not expected it to start feeling, by the 2nd year, less like rest, and more like a slow erosion of everything she'd once been useful for. The store owner, a widow herself named Hattie Foss, who'd given Margaret the room more out of old friendship than business sense, found her still standing with the letter an hour later, and asked gently whether the news was bad. Not bad, Margaret said. Just old. Wearing a new coat, she folded the letter along its existing creases. An old friend needs help. I'm not certain anyone else can give him. I find I don't much like the idea of him going without it, simply because the asking made him uncomfortable. Hattie studied her a moment, the particular look of a woman who'd watched Margaret fold herself smaller and smaller over 18 months without ever quite saying so out loud. You've been waiting for a letter like that without knowing it, haven't you? Margaret didn't answer directly, because the honest answer embarrassed her slightly. The recognition that grief and idleness had left her hungrier for purpose than she'd allowed herself to admit even in the privacy of her own thinking. She packed her trunk before the afternoon was out. The stage to Brazos Hollow took the better part of 2 days, rattling through country that grew drier and harder the further west it carried her, limestone breaking through the soil in pale ridges that reminded her, more than she expected, of ground she hadn't walked in over 4 decades. She had not thought much, in recent years, about the supply post her father had run near the edge of the frontier, the kind of settlement most respectable families of her childhood had considered too dangerous to attempt. She thought about it now. Watching the country roll past the stage window, memories surfacing the way old water finds its way back to the surface when something disturbs the ground above it. Her father had not been a soldier. He had been a merchant who'd understood, with a clarity that had taken Margaret years to fully appreciate, that surviving on contested ground required the same discipline, whether or not a person carried a weapon. She remembered him stringing wire low across the approach road to their post, explaining without any particular drama which gaps mattered and which didn't, why a man should never build a wall he couldn't see past, why silence sometimes told you more than any amount of watching. She remembered, too, the watchtower he'd raised from green lumber in 4 days flat, because 4 days had been as long as anyone believed the post had before trouble found it, and the particular pride she'd felt at 13, helping pass up boards, not understanding yet that her father was teaching her something that would matter far longer than the tower itself ever stood. She had been 19 when she left that life behind to marry Joseph, trading wire and watchtowers for law books and courtroom benches, and she had not, in all the years since, expected any of it to matter again. It surprised her, now, how readily it returned. Like a language she'd assumed forgotten, arriving back in full sentences the moment she had reason to speak it again. Walter Coombs met her at the porch steps, with a cane he held like an accusation against his own body, and the sight of him stopped her for a moment, before she trusted herself to keep walking forward. She had last seen him at Joseph's funeral, 18 months back, a broad-shouldered man of 66 who had carried himself with the easy strength of someone who'd spent his whole life moving cattle and hauling fence posts. The man on the porch now had aged considerably more than 18 months should have allowed, his face thinner, his shoulders set with the careful economy of someone who'd learned, recently and the hard way, exactly how much his body would and wouldn't tolerate. "You came," he said, and something in his voice carried disbelief that hadn't fully resolved even with her standing in front of him. "You asked," Margaret said. "In 30 years of knowing you, I can't recall you ever asking for much. Seemed worth taking seriously when you finally did." He almost smiled, the expression costing him visible effort, and she watched that cost register without comment, filing it the way she'd learned to file most things now, quietly without remark, because remark rarely helped a man who was already working hard enough, simply to stand upright on his own porch. Over coffee that evening he told her what the doctor in town had said, the particular vocabulary of a physician choosing his words to soften a diagnosis that didn't soften easily regardless. His heart had given him serious trouble through January, bad enough that 2 separate nights he genuinely believed he wouldn't see morning. Though he hadn't told anyone that part at the time, hadn't wanted to frighten the hands or burden a doctor already doing what he could. He was better now, though better, the doctor had been careful to specify, did not mean cured, only meant managed, meant careful, meant a different relationship with his own body than the one he'd carried for 68 years prior. "There's no family left to write to," he added, almost as an afterthought, though Margaret understood it wasn't an afterthought at all, simply a truth he'd practiced saying lightly so it wouldn't cost him as much in the telling. "Wife passed 19 years back. We never had children," the doctors could explain, "and I never remarried, not for lack of opportunities so much as lack of wanting it badly enough." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "A man gets used to being alone. Doesn't mean he stops noticing it, especially in a year like this one. I've got Terence for the heavy work," he continued, the subject changing the way a man changes subjects when he said more than he meant to. "Steady man, good hands, doesn't say 3 words a day but does the work of 3 men without complaint. Miguel handles the stock alongside him. And there's a boy, Daniel, 17, works hard, hasn't yet learned everything he thinks he's already learned, but he's honest. And honest goes a long way out here." He paused, something in his expression shifting into more careful territory. "What I haven't got is anyone who can look a man dead in the eye while he's trying to take something from me and know, before he's finished his sentence, whether he means to do it through the courts or through something considerably less civilized." "And you believe someone intends to try," Margaret said. "I believe word travels in a county this size whether a man wants it to or not. I believe a man's laid up sick for 3 weeks, might as well have announced it from the church steps. And I believe Wendell Crane has spent 11 years waiting for exactly the kind of opening my illness handed him. He said the name with the flat economy of a man who, long ago, decided not to waste further emotion on it. A sick old widower with no children, left to inherit anything looks, to a man like Crane, less like a neighbor and more like an opportunity. She asked him to explain the water, not the cattle count or the fence lines. Because in country like this, the water was always the thing sitting beneath every other thing. And she had learned that lesson from Joseph long before she'd had reason to learn it anywhere else. Walter explained it with the careful patience of a man uncertain he'd get the chance to explain it twice. An artesian shelf ran deep beneath the valley floor, more than 30 feet down, a vein that didn't care what the sky offered or withheld in any given season. His grandfather had found it. His father had built the ranch's entire fortune from it. And in the past decade, careful surveying work, paid for by interests outside the county, had mapped the shelf well enough that everyone with a stake in local water now understood an uncomfortable truth. The Coombs Ranch didn't merely sit on good water. It sat on the recharge point that fed nearly every well within 10 miles that Crane didn't already own, outright. There was a man 2 counties over, years back, tried to fight a claim like this through the courts the proper way, Walter said. Caught a sickness that came on faster than anyone could account for, and was dead inside a month. And the land went to whoever was buying disastrous claims that season. He let the words settle before continuing. I'm not telling you I know what happened to him. I'm telling you I noticed it happened, and I noticed how few questions got asked about it afterward, and I'd rather you carry that knowledge into this than discover it the hard way partway through. Margaret felt something old and steady settle into place inside her chest, same stillness that used to come over her in Joseph's courtroom whenever a case stopped being about the law. Written down and started being about the law that actually governed who got hurt and who got protected. She had sat beside him through enough of those cases to recognize the shape forming here, even with most of the players still unfamiliar to her. Who else? She said. Not a question so much as a request for inventory. Walter gave her names. Crane first, the largest landholder for 3 directions. 51 and built like a fence post, a man who hadn't lost a negotiation in over a decade because he'd stopped negotiating somewhere around year 4 and simply started waiting people out instead. His foreman, Silas Tate. 45. The one who delivered the parts of Crane's intentions that Crane preferred not to attach his own name to directly. A third name, not yet arrived but expected within the fortnight, a consortium lawyer out of Fort Worth named Marcus Reed. A man who carried satchels of paper instead of weapons and understood the paper could do considerably more damage. A fourth name came last, said with a flatness different from the others, costing Walter something the rest hadn't. Sheriff Otis Pruitt. Walter said the name and then offered nothing further for a long moment, which carried its own particular weight. You suspect the sheriff's bought, Margaret said. I suspect the sheriff rode out here in February wearing a coat his salary wouldn't stretch to, and asked after my health, with the interest of a man checking on an investment rather than a neighbor checking on a neighbor. Walter's jaw tightened once. I haven't got proof. I've got 40 years of knowing when a feeling deserves trust, and this one does. That first night, lying in the small room off the kitchen that would now be hers, Margaret listened to a house still unfamiliar settling around her, and let her mind do the thing it had, apparently decided to start doing again, without asking her permission first, which was to walk the property in memory, slow and methodical, building a map out of nothing but attention. The approach road from the north sat wide and exposed. A dry creek bed cut in from the west between 2 ridges, narrow enough to overlook if a person wasn't watching for it, wide enough to ride through if they were looking for exactly that kind of overlooked access. 2 rises rose to the east with a clean line of sight down into the yard below. The barn sat at an angle that left a blind pocket on the south side of the house, the kind of gap her father would have addressed within the first week of noticing it. She thought of him then properly for the first time in years, the wire he'd strung and the calm, unhurried way he'd explained to a 19-year-old daughter which gaps in a fence line mattered and which didn't. She had not understood, at 19, that she was being handed something that would outlast nearly everything else he ever gave her. She understood it now, lying awake in a stranger's house belonging to a sick old man with nobody else left to ask. She rose before breakfast and walked the fence lines alone, dressed against a morning that still carried winter's leftover bite, despite the calendar's insistence otherwise. The air smelled of wet limestone and cold mesquite, and the quiet out here ran deeper than the quiet above the dry goods store ever had, a fuller kind of silence that asked something of a person rather than simply surrounding them. She found 2 places where wire had been cut and restrung, the splicing too clean for ranch hands going about ordinary repair, too recent and too careful, the work of someone who'd wanted the fence to read as untouched to anyone, not looking closely enough to notice otherwise. She found boot prints on the eastern rise several days old, the spacing of a man who'd stood still a long while rather than walked through on any honest business. 2 distinct sets. She crouched and studied them longer than the discovery alone required, because something in their placement bothered her, in a way she couldn't yet name, and she had learned decades ago not to dismiss the things that bothered her before she could put a name to why. Daniel found her crouched there mid-morning, 17, and working hard to carry himself older than his years allowed, leading a horse back from the far pasture. He slowed at the sight of her, curiosity plain on a face that hadn't yet learned to hide much of anything. "Lose something, ma'am?" "Found something," Margaret said, rising and brushing the dirt from her palms. Working out what it means, more accurately. He studied the boot prints with open interest. "Those weren't there last week." "I'd have noticed if they were, I believe you," Margaret said, and meant it, because his tone carried the particular confidence of someone who genuinely paid attention to his own ground rather than simply claiming to. "How long have you worked this ranch, Daniel?" "Since I was 13. Mr. Coombs took me on after my pa passed. Haven't had much family otherwise, not since." He said it plainly. No self-pity, dressing it up, the way boys said true things before they learned to either hide them or perform them for sympathy. "He's a good man. Worried about him bad this winter." "Worried now, too. If I'm honest, though, I couldn't tell you what good the worrying does." "It does some good," Margaret said. "Worries attention wearing a heavier coat than usual. The trick lies in making the attention useful, instead of letting it just sit there being heavy." She studied him a moment, weighing something. "Have you seen anyone unfamiliar riding through here these past weeks? Anyone without business being on this land?" His brow furrowed, working through memory with the visible effort of someone unused to being asked, to retrieve something specific rather than simply react to what was in front of him. "There was a man," he said slowly, "maybe 10 days back. Didn't come up to the house. Sat his horse out past the east rise a good while, just looking down at everything. Told Terrence about it. Terrence figured probably some hand looking for stray cattle. Didn't think much more of it. What did he look like?" "Thin. Hard-faced. Sat his horse like he'd done a great deal of sitting on horses in his life, if that makes any sense to you." Daniel hesitated, then added, almost embarrassed by the detail. Had a way of holding the reins loose in one hand, like he trusted the horse more than most men trust their own legs. Never seen anybody else sit a horse quite that easy. It made considerable sense to Margaret, more than she let show. A boy who could describe how a stranger held his reins, rather than merely that he had been on a horse, was a boy who noticed more than he yet understood he noticed. She thanked him, told him to keep noticing, and went to find Walter, with a question that wouldn't keep until evening. She found him on the porch sorting through a small wooden box of papers, with the slow, conserving movements of a man rationing strength he didn't have much surplus of. He looked up at her approach, and whatever showed on her face told him plainly enough that she hadn't come to discuss the weather. "Tell me about Tate," she said. "Specifically tell me whether you trust him enough to believe he's the one who's been walking your fences, or whether someone else has been doing the looking ahead of him arriving. Tate's not my foreman. He's Crane's." Walter set the papers down. "And no, I trust him about as far as I could throw him these days, which is not far at all." A pause, something sharpening in his attention. "You found something more." "I found two men who stood long enough on your east rise to leave matched boot prints, and cut your wire clean enough to hide the cutting from anyone not looking closely." "That isn't curiosity, Walter. That's someone building a picture of this place before deciding how best to come at it." His hand tightened slightly against the chair arm, the only outward sign the words had landed exactly where she'd meant them to. How long do you think we have? I don't know yet, Margaret said honestly. But I know roughly how this kind of pressure usually moves. Someone sends people to look first. Then someone comes to talk, official and polite, offering an easy way out before the harder one. When the talking fails, the politeness tends to fail along with it. She thought of the lawyer Walter had mentioned, the one not yet arrived. You said this man Reed is expected within the fortnight. That's the word I've had, last I heard. Then we have until he arrives to understand exactly what we're standing against. Because once he's here, the legal pressure begins in earnest, and legal pressure grows harder to push back against once it's already filed somewhere bearing a county seal. She gestured toward the box. I'd like to see every document touching this land. Deeds, surveys, anything with the water right named anywhere in it. Walter's hand was already moving toward the box before she'd finished the request. The motionlessness of a man who hadn't realized how badly he'd needed someone to simply begin doing what needed doing. She spent the remainder of the day at the kitchen table, with the papers arranged in careful order, the way she used to arrange Joseph's case files on the evenings he'd bring home work that troubled him too much to leave behind at the courthouse. The deed itself read straightforward and old, signed decades back by Walter's father, the water right named without any ambiguity. But beneath it, in a folder nearly overlooked among the others, sat a survey document dated only 4 months prior, filed through the county surveyor's office, its language dense and evasive in the particular way. Official documents grew dense whenever someone wanted their true purpose buried beneath enough words to discourage most readers from finishing. She read it twice, then slower a third time, hunting now not for what the sentences claimed to mean, but for the places where they worked unusually hard to avoid saying a simple thing directly. The survey reclassified a portion of the valley's water source, not as private holding, as shared communal resource, available to adjoining landholders under a use doctrine she didn't recognize by name, but understood completely in function. A document like that, left unchallenged, didn't merely weaken Walter's claim. It dissolved the exclusivity of the water right entirely, opening the recharge point to Crane's wells as recorded law rather than something Crane would ever need to fight openly to obtain. Margaret sat motionless for a long moment, the stillness of someone who has just understood that the danger she'd been watching for had, quietly, already arrived. She found Walter dozing in the front room, vulnerable in a way he likely didn't realize he looked when sleep loosened the careful composure he otherwise kept. She woke him gently and watched disdain cross his face as she explained what the survey claimed. The slow arrival of a man realizing the threat he'd written to her about hadn't been approaching at all. It had landed months earlier on paper, while he lay too weak to read his own mail closely enough to notice. 4 months, he said. I was barely out of bed 4 months back, I know. Who filed it? She checked the signature line. County, Surveyor, Albert Finch. Walter's expression hardened into something younger and harder than anything she'd seen from him since arriving. I've known Finch 15 years. Nervous little man. Never struck me as someone who'd cross a line on his own account. He likely didn't, Margaret said, which means someone crossed it for him and paid him to put his signature beneath it. She set the document down carefully, the way one sets down something that might still bite if handled wrong. I'll want to speak with him. Soon. Before he has time to compare Deproutes with whoever's paying him and get his accounts straightened out in advance. Walter studied her for a long moment, something complicated working behind his eyes. Gratitude tangled together with a bewildered kind of relief, the look of a man who had spent an entire winter feeling thoroughly alone with a danger he could sense but not name, watching that danger get named and mapped and met with something resembling an actual plan inside the space of a single day. Joseph used to talk about you, he said finally. Said you were sharper on a case than half the lawyers who ever argued in front of him. Said you'd have made one fine judge yourself if the world had ever permitted women to sit a bench. Margaret felt something tighten briefly in her throat, the grief that came less often now, but never arrived gently when it did choose to surface. He exaggerated, she said, once she trusted her voice steady again, though not by quite as much as I used to tell him he did. You don't have to do this, Walter said, something careful entering his tone now, a man working to give her an exit he half hoped she wouldn't take, I wrote asking for a caretaker. I didn't write asking you to step into something this dangerous on my account. You didn't ask me to, Margaret agreed, but I've spent 18 months of a dry goods store doing piecework that asked nothing of me beyond steady hands, Walter, and I'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to be asked for something more. She looked at him directly. Joseph spent 30 years teaching me how to see the shape of a lie before it finished forming. I'd hoped never to need that particular skill again. I find I don't entirely regret needing it now, strange as that may sound. He didn't answer that directly, only nodded once, too moved to trust his voice further that evening. That night, after Walter had gone to bed and the house had quieted around her, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table a while longer, with the documents still spread before her, turning the day's discoveries over the way she used to turn over a difficult case. Once Joseph had gone to sleep beside her, working out in solitude what she'd avoid saying aloud sound, until the shape was certain. Finch's signature troubled her less than the timing of the filing did. 4 months prior, placed it squarely within the worst of Walter's illness, a window when he'd been least capable of noticing anything beyond his own labored breathing, which told her something about whoever had orchestrated it. They hadn't simply taken advantage of an opportunity. They had been watching closely enough to know precisely when that opportunity would open. That kind of attention didn't come cheap, and didn't come from a single foreman riding fence lines on his own initiative. It came from a sustained effort, patient and deliberate. The kind of campaign a man mounted, only when he expected to win and intended to leave as little evidence as possible of how he'd won it. She banked the kitchen fire and walked once more to the front window before retiring, looking out over a yard gone dark and a valley beyond it she still didn't fully know the shape of. Somewhere out past the eastern rise, she understood now with a certainty she hadn't possessed 24 hours earlier. Men were already moving pieces into position for a conflict that hadn't yet announced itself openly, and the fragment of recognition that had stirred in her at Daniel's description of a stranger's loose grip on the reins remained exactly where she'd left it, unresolved, patient, waiting on a moment she could feel approaching, without yet being able to name its shape. Outside, the light had begun its slow slide toward dusk, gold sliding to amber across the limestone ridges, and somewhere beyond the eastern rise, in country, Margaret had not yet walked but already understood the shape of. A thin, hard-faced man sat his horse and watched the ranch he'd been sent to study. Not yet aware that the woman now inside it had spent half her life learning to read exactly the kind of trouble he represented. She did not know his name yet, not fully, not in the way that would matter. But something in her had stirred. Hearing Daniel describe the stranger's ease in the saddle, the way it pulled at a memory she couldn't yet place. Something old and unresolved sitting just beyond the edge of clear recollection. She would not chase it tonight. Marwara would bring Finch, and whatever Finch's confession revealed would bring its own set of consequences neither she nor Walter had finished preparing for, and the careful order she'd built across this single long day was, she understood clearly even as she banked down toward sleep, only the first thin layer of a defense that would need to grow considerably thicker before it could hold against whatever was already, patiently, gathering against it. Albert Finch kept his office in a narrow brick building 2 doors down from the courthouse, and Margaret had not even crossed the threshold before she understood why Walter had described him as a nervous little man. He sat behind a desk built for someone with considerably more presence than he carried, ink permanently threaded into the creases of his fingers, and when the door opened to admit a woman he didn't recognize, his whole body performed the flinch of someone who'd spent 4 months dreading exactly this knock and had simply hoped, against reason, that it would never actually arrive. He hadn't moved fast enough to compose himself before she'd taken the chair across from him without waiting to be invited into it. "I'm here about a survey amendment," Margaret said, filed in February, reclassifying a portion of the Coombs water source as communal. Finch's hands found each other on the desktop and held on. "I'm afraid I don't recall the specifics of every filing that passes through this office, ma'am. There's a great many documents that you filed it 4 months after a sick man took to his bed, and before he was strong enough to read his own mail," Margaret said, not unkindly, though without slowing for him either. "I doubt a document like that passes through unnoticed. I suspect you remember it, rather well. The silence that followed told her everything his words had been built to avoid telling her. She let it sit, the way Joseph used to let silences sit in his courtroom, because an unfilled silence often did more honest work than any direct question could manage. $300, Finch said finally, the admission arriving small and defeated, the sound of a man whose internal pressure had simply given out under the weight of holding it any longer. I was told it was correcting an earlier error in the original survey, that the language needed updating to reflect an oversight from years back. His eyes lifted to hers, pleading now in a way that made him look younger than his years and his desk look considerably larger around him. I didn't ask many questions. Told myself I didn't need to. I've tried hard not to think on it since, though I can't say I've managed it well. Who paid you? His hands tightened further. I never met the man directly. The money came through Sheriff Pruitt, said it was a favor for a friend of the county, said it'd be cleaner all around if I didn't ask whose friend that was. When did Pruitt first approach you about it? Finch's eyes went somewhere distant, calculating backward. January. Toward the end of it. He came by on a Sunday, which struck me as odd at the time. A sheriff doing courthouse business on a Sunday. I understand now why he chose the day he did. He swallowed. That would have been right around when Mr. Coombs took ill bad enough that half the county heard about it. I didn't connect the two at the time. I've connected them plenty since. Margaret felt the timeline tighten in her mind. The gap between Walter's collapse and the first approach to Finch, closing to something under a week, which told her more clearly than anything else had, so far exactly how closely someone had been watching for this particular opening. Write it down, she said. Everything you've told me, the amount, the date, what Pruitt said and how he said it, including the Sunday and what that told you once you understood it. Sign your name beneath it. Finch's face moved through several expressions in quick succession before landing on something between relief and terror, the look of a man being offered the chance to set down a weight he'd carried badly and for far too long. Crane will know it was me, he said. There won't be anyone else it could have been. Crane already suspects it was you, Margaret said. The only question left is whether you let that suspicion sit on your conscience for the rest of your life, or whether you decide today what kind of man you actually want to have been when this is finished. She slid a fresh sheet of paper across the desk toward him. I'd think on that quickly, Mr. Finch. Decisions made honestly tend to sit easier than ones made out of fear. No matter how long the fears had to settle in first, he wrote it. His hands shook through most of the effort, letters cramped and uneven in places, but he wrote every word she'd asked for and signed his name beneath it with the finality of a man finally stepping off a ledge he'd been standing on, unacknowledged, for months. She folded the statement into the pocket where she'd carried the survey amendment in, and walked back out into the Brazos Hollow. Afternoon carrying the particular weight of holding evidence nobody else yet knew existed. The letter to Austin went out that same day, written at the kitchen table in her own careful hand, addressed to a woman named Ellen Marsh at the State Land Office. Margaret had known her since the early years of Joseph's time on the bench, when Ellen had been a young clerk and Joseph a young judge, and the two of them had corresponded for years on land title disputes that crossed county lines in ways the local courts weren't equipped to untangle cleanly. Margaret had written to her only twice since Joseph's death. This made the third, and she chose her words with the particular care of someone asking a favor from a friendship that had survived mostly on old respect rather than recent contact. She described the amendment in full. She asked Ellen to check it against the registered water, write filings for the county to confirm, through standing, the local courts couldn't easily dismiss what Margaret already believed she knew. She didn't mention Finch's confession. Some things traveled safer in a coat pocket than committed to paper that might pass through hands other than the ones intended. She sealed the letter and gave it to Daniel to carry into town for the evening stage, watching him ride off toward the North Road with the bearing of a boy who understood, correctly, that he'd been trusted with something that mattered. It was 4 days later, not the same week as Finch's confession, but well clear of it, when Marcus Reed finally arrived in the county and found his own way to Daniel without anyone arranging the meeting for him. Daniel had been mending fence near the road, the sun high and the morning already warm enough that he'd shed his coat and hung it over a post when the buggy rolled up slow and stopped a polite distance off. A tall man in a gray coat stepped down with the unhurried manner of someone who had never once needed to rush toward anything in his life. Boots barely raising dust despite the dry road, and Daniel found himself straightening without quite meaning to, the way a person straightens in front of someone who carries themselves like their time matters more than yours. Reed introduced himself with a warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes, asked after the fence work with what sounded like genuine interest, complimented Daniel's hands for the job he'd done, splicing a difficult section of wire. Daniel, flattered to be addressed as though his opinion carried weight, didn't notice the warmth's shallowness until considerably later that evening, lying awake turning the conversation over until it stopped feeling ordinary and started feeling like something else entirely. Reed had asked, almost as an afterthought folded between questions about the weather and the cattle, and the weather the well ever ran low in August, exactly how many people were currently living and working at the Coombs place. Daniel had answered without thinking much of it at the time. Mr. Coombs, Terrence, Miguel, the new woman, Mrs. Hollis, who'd come to help while Mr. Coombs mended, himself. 5 souls keeping the whole place running, Reed had said, almost to himself, the comment small enough that Daniel hadn't thought to question its tone. That's lean for a property this size. Must keep all of you busy from sunup. Reed had thanked him, pressed $2 into his palm with a comment about appreciating a young man's time, and driven on toward town. And it was only that night, staring at the bunkhouse ceiling, that Daniel began to understand he'd given something away without meaning to. The precise size and shape of a household Crane's people would need to account for. And that the $2 in his pocket had purchased exactly that, and nothing more. He carried the guilt for 2 full days before it grew heavy enough to force its way out of him. He found Margaret alone at the corral on the 3rd morning, and confessed the whole of it in a rush. Words tumbling faster than his nerve could keep pace with, certain she would look at him the way a person looks at someone who has failed them at the worst possible moment. She didn't. What exactly did you tell him? She asked. Calm, no accusation threaded through it. Just numbers. How many of us are here? Nothing about the wire or the rises or anything Mr. Coombs told you about. His voice cracked on the apology that followed it. I should have known better. Should have asked why a stranger needed to know any of that in the first place. You're 17, and a man who's made a profession of asking careless-sounding questions asked you one kindly. That isn't a failure of character, Daniel. That's a lesson most grown men don't learn until it's cost them a good deal more than $2 to find out. She studied him a moment, something easing in her face without losing any of its steadiness. My own father used to say fear and shame travel together. So often a person forgets they're 2 separate things. Fear makes you answer a question you shouldn't have. Shame is what convinces you afterward to hide that you answered it at all. The second one does considerably more damage than the first. If you let it run unchecked long enough, she held his gaze. What matters now isn't what you told him. It's that you told me. You understand the difference between the two? He nodded. Throat too tight to manage words, and she let the silence sit long enough for him to recover inside it. Rather than crowding it with further explanation, he didn't yet have room to hear. Your father would have been proud of how you handled the second part, Margaret added. Gentler now, the coming forward part. That's the harder half of the lesson, and you managed it on your own without anyone pushing you toward it. Daniel's eyes went bright at that, and he turned quickly to check the corral fence that needed no checking, giving himself a moment to recover his composure before he trusted his voice again. What she didn't tell him that morning, because she hadn't fully worked it out for herself yet, was how strange the information Reed had purchased actually was in its modesty. A lawyer building a legal case against a man's water claim had no real need for account of who slept beneath his roof. That detail belonged to a different kind of planning entirely, the sort a man gathered ahead of something requiring him to know, in advance, exactly how many people he'd need to account for once a different sort of operation got underway. She turned that thought over carefully through the rest of the day and didn't care for where it kept leading her, and resolved, without saying so to anyone yet, to watch Reed's movements and considerably more closely than she'd planned to before. Silas Tate came to the ranch himself 5 days later, alone, at an hour calculated to be witnessed by as many people as possible, hat pushed back, coat open so both hands stayed visible the whole ride in. He stopped at the gate and called out a greeting pitched for an audience, rather than a private conversation, and Margaret, who had been half expecting something like this, since the boot prints on the eastern rise weeks earlier, walked out to meet him with the unhurried calm of a woman who had spent decades watching men perform exactly this kind of arrival in courtrooms. Moments before lying under oath with their hands resting on a Bible. Behind her, in the front window, Walter watched from his chair, too weak to stand at the gate himself, but unwilling to retreat fully out of sight either, his hand resting near the Winchester, propped within reach against the wall, not raised, not yet needed. Simply present the way a held breath is present before it's released. Tate's eyes found Margaret, and something crossed his face she couldn't immediately place. Not quite surprise, closer to recalculation, the look of a man who'd been told to expect one shape of obstacle and arrived to find a different one waiting for him instead. As he drew nearer, she noticed, for the first time clearly, a thin pale scar running along his jaw on the left side, old, the kind that came from a blade rather than a fall, and something about the particular angle of it pulled harder at the unresolved fragment of memory than anything had managed to before. Not the whole of it yet, but closer, a shape gaining edges. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Coombs," he said. "He's resting," Margaret said. "Speak to me." A muscle worked in his jaw. Mr. Crane is a patient man, but his patience has limits the same as anyone's. The offer on this water right is more than fair, given the circumstances. And Mr. Coombs would be wise to take it before circumstances change in ways nobody particularly wants. What circumstances would those be, exactly? "The kind that grow harder to manage the longer they're left sitting," Tate said, and something in how he said it carried a practiced quality, words he'd clearly delivered before, in other yards, to other people standing where she stood now, and Margaret found herself wondering, briefly, and with a coldness she didn't examine too closely in the moment, how many ranches this same conversation had visited before it ever reached hers. "I'll tell him you came," she said. "I'll also tell him about the survey amendment filed in February and the $300 that paid for it, and the sheriff who carried that money from whoever actually wrote the check behind it." She watched his face carefully as she said it, and was rewarded with the smallest flicker, gone almost before it fully arrived, but present long enough to confirm what she'd already suspected about how deep this ran. "I imagine that information travels to Austin a good deal faster than Mr. Crane's patience is prepared to wait for." The silence that followed stretched longer than his earlier pause had. Tate's horse shifted, restless under him, and he steadied it with a small motion of one hand without breaking eye contact. When he spoke again, the performance had thinned considerably, something more careful and considering underneath it. "You don't know what you're stepping into," he said. Quieter now, and there was something close to a warning in it, though not the kind he'd evidently arrived intending to give. "I've stepped into worse," Margaret said, and meant it more fully than she expected the words to land even as she spoke them. Arriving from somewhere older than this conversation, somewhere that still remembered watchtowers raised in 4 days, and wires strung low across roads. Other men's grandfathers had once tried to ride through uninvited. "Tell Mr. Crane the answer's no. Tell him it stays no. And tell him whatever he sends next had better be prepared for the fact that this household already knows a great deal more about his methods than he's comfortable with." Tate looked at her a long moment, something working behind his eyes she still couldn't fully name, and then turned his mount without another word, riding back toward the North Road at a pace that suggested he had considerably more to think over now than he'd arrived carrying. Margaret watched him go, the scar along his jaw still sitting in her mind alongside the loose, trusting way he'd held his reins, 2 details now instead of 1, the fragment gaining substance even as its full shape continued to resist her. Behind her, Walter's hand had eased away from the Winchester, and when she turned back toward the porch, his face carried an expression somewhere between admiration and something close to fear on her behalf. "You held that ground like you've done it before." "I've watched it done before," Margaret said. "By better hands than mine. Sometimes that's enough to borrow against when the moment calls for it." She told Walter everything that evening, laid it across the kitchen table the way she used to lay cases out for Joseph. Methodical, unhurried, every piece given its proper weight before she moved to the next. Finch's confession, including the detail of Pruitt's Sunday visit that placed the whole scheme's first motion within a week of Walter's collapse. The letter to Ellen Marsh. Reed's strange interest in a simple count of who lived under Walter's roof. Tate's visit and the threat wrapped carefully inside its surface courtesy. Walter listened without interrupting, the particular silence of a man who'd spent a winter alone with fears. He hadn't fully managed to articulate even to himself. Now, watching someone else articulate them with a precision that landed as both comfort and unsettlement in roughly equal measure. "You think they mean to come at night," he said when she'd finished. Not a question, a conclusion he'd reached himself. Watching the shape of everything she'd laid before him, "I think the legal route was always meant to come first, because it's cheaper and keeps Crane's hands officially clean," Margaret said. But Reed's question to Daniel wasn't a lawyer's question, it was a planner's question. Men who plan around exact head counts are usually planning for something that requires knowing precisely how many people they'll need to deal with when the moment comes. She let that settle before continuing. "I don't believe we have the luxury of waiting to discover which kind of trouble arrives first. I believe we prepare for both at once." How? She'd been turning it over since her first night walking the property in the dark, building the map out of old memory and training she'd thought long buried. The dry creek bed on the west needed wire, low and quiet, strung not to stop a man outright but to announce him. Copper bells that would ring soft and unmistakable the moment any horse brushed against the line. The eastern rise needed a watcher with a signal lantern that could be turned to face the house, the same arrangement her father had once run at the supply post. Decades before either of them had been born into the lives they now led. The barn's blind pocket on the south side needed addressing, hay rearranged in the loft, to give Terrence a clear line if matters ever came to that. And the main road from the north, the obvious approach, the one any careful planner would expect to be watched closely, needed to look exactly as unwatched as it always had. Because the appearance of vulnerability sometimes accomplished more than visible strength ever could on its own. The work began the following morning. Daniel and Terrence carried wire and a small crate of copper bells down to the creek bed before the heat of the day set in, and Margaret walked the line with them, adjusting the height twice when she judged it sitting too high to catch a horse's leg reliably, explaining as she went why the bells needed spacing wide enough to ring distinctly, rather than bunched into a single confusing clatter. Daniel's hands had gone steady with the work, the careful focus of a boy determined to do this exactly right after the lesson. The week's mistake had cost him. Miguel took the eastern rise that evening, climbing it, with the signal lantern wrapped in cloth against the wind, testing the angle until he found the precise spot where its light would show clearly toward the house, but stay invisible from the road below. He called down once the position satisfied him, and Margaret, watching from the yard, felt something in her chest ease slightly at the sight of it, a single point of readiness established in country that 2 weeks earlier had held nothing but threat she could sense without yet being able to defend against. Sheriff Pruitt rode out to the ranch 2 mornings after that, and Margaret understood, watching him approach from the porch, that someone had already told him about Finch's confession. Because a man who rode that carefully, that deliberately unhurried, was a man working hard to appear as though he had nothing to be unhurried about. He didn't dismount at first. Sat his horse at the gate the way Tate had, though without Tate's practiced ease, something stiffer running underneath it. "Heard you've been asking questions in town," he said. "I've been asking questions everywhere," Margaret said. "It's a habit I never managed to break, even when breaking it might have made my life considerably simpler. Some questions are better left where they are, and some men have a vested interest in convincing other people of exactly that." She watched Wood's jaw tighten, the small involuntary tell of a man unused to being addressed without the deference his badge usually purchased him without effort. "I imagine $300 passing through your hands on its way to Albert Finch feels like something you'd prefer stayed buried. I imagine it surfaces regardless of how badly you'd prefer otherwise." Pruitt's hand drifted toward his saddle horn, not quite a threat. closer to a man steadying himself against words that had landed harder than he'd expected them to. "You don't know what you're accusing me of." "I know precisely what I'm accusing you of, because Finch wrote it down in his own hand and signed his name beneath it." Margaret kept her voice level, the same evenness she'd learned, watching Joseph deliver verdicts that ruined men's comfortable assumptions about themselves, without ever once raising his voice to do it. "The only thing left undecided, Sheriff, is whether you land on the right side of this before or after it becomes public record. I'd think carefully about which timing serves you better, because I suspect you won't get to choose both." He held her gaze a long moment, something working behind his eyes that looked less like anger now and more like a man doing arithmetic he didn't care for the answer to, and then turned his horse without another word and rode back toward town at a pace considerably less unhurried than the one he'd arrived with. Walter, watching the whole exchange from the porch, let out a breath he seemed to have been holding through most of it. "You've just made an enemy of the county's law." "I made an enemy of a man who was already one," Margaret said. "I simply removed the comfort of his believing we hadn't noticed yet." She looked toward the north road, empty now but somehow heavier for its emptiness than it had been an hour earlier. "We're past the point of letting anyone believe we're moving slower than we are, Walter. Every day we let them think otherwise is a day they spend planning around an assumption that's no longer true." Ellen Marsh's reply arrived 11 days after Margaret's letter had gone out, carried up from town by Daniel with the particular care of a boy who now understood fully the weight of what he carried, even before he knew what the envelope held. Margaret opened it at the kitchen table with Walter watching from across it, his color better than it had been 3 weeks earlier, the cane leaning against his chair, now more out of habit than necessity. Ellen's hand was as precise as Margaret remembered, 3 decades unchanged. The same careful slant to every letter that had once filled the margins of Joseph's case files, with corrections he'd been too proud to ask for and too grateful to refuse outright. The letter confirmed what Margaret had suspected since her first careful reading of the February amendment. The reclassification had no foundation in any genuine survey error. There was no prior oversight being corrected, because no such oversight had ever existed to correct. The amendment had been built whole, from nothing, constructed specifically to manufacture the communal designation it only pretended to be clarifying. More than that, Ellen had found something Margaret hadn't thought to ask for, but recognized immediately as more valuable than anything else in the envelope: a pattern. 2 other counties, in the years since Ellen had taken her current post, had seen nearly identical amendments filed against water-rich properties belonging to men recently widowed, recently ill, or recently without close family positioned to contest a claim quickly. Both prior amendments had originated through the same Fort Worth consortium. Both had named Marcus Reed as the filing attorney of record. Margaret read that section twice, feeling the danger widen in her chest, even as the path forward sharpened alongside it. This had never been a single grasping neighbor, testing the edges of one old man's vulnerability. This was a method, refined and repeated, a machine built to locate exactly this kind of weakness, and exploit it with the patience of men who had done it enough times to know precisely how long fear took to wear a person down to compliance. "He's done this before," she said aloud, watching Walter absorb the words, "more than once." "Which means the fear he's counting on was never really about you specifically. It's about a pattern he's learned reliably works on men in your position, regardless of which man it happens to be." "Does that help us?" Walter asked, genuine uncertainty in it, the question of a man searching for solid ground in information that felt, at first hearing, like it only made the danger larger and harder to hold. "It helps enormously," Margaret said. "A pattern is something a court can see clearly. A single man's bad luck is harder to prove malicious, easy to wave away as coincidence. A documented method, repeated 3 times across 3 counties, stops looking like circumstance and starts looking like exactly what it is." She set the letter down, feeling the shape of the danger sharpen into something almost workable. But Ellen also writes that the consortium has grown careful about how quickly these schemes move once a target shows signs of fighting back. The other 2 cases both saw the pressure escalate the moment local resistance organized. "I don't think Reed will sit quietly through a 30-day window once he learns." This much has already come together against him. She called Daniel and Terence in from the yard that afternoon, a decision she weighed briefly before making it, because the household had a right to understand the full shape of what they were standing inside of, rather than simply following instructions. Without knowing why those instructions mattered, she laid out the pattern for both of them the way she'd laid it out for Walter, plainly, without softening the danger, but without exaggerating it either. The careful balance she'd learned from years of watching Joseph explain difficult verdicts to people who needed the truth delivered whole, rather than in pieces too small to feel its full weight. Terence listened with his usual silence, absorbing rather than reacting, and when she'd finished, he asked only one question. "What do you need from us that we're not already doing?" "Vigilance that doesn't sleep," Margaret said. "I think the window we believed we had has likely already started closing faster than 30 days allows. I want every one of us watching with that assumption in mind, not the easier one." Daniel's jaw had tightened through the explanation, the particular stillness of a boy working hard not to let fear show on his face in front of people he wanted to think well of him. "Is this because of what I told that lawyer?" he asked, the old guilt resurfacing even now, weeks past the moment Margaret had thought it settled. "This is because men like Crane have spent a decade refining a method that works," Margaret said, gentle but firm. "Nothing you did changed the shape of that method, Daniel. You gave them a head count they'd have found another way to learn regardless. What matters now isn't assigning blame backward. It's making sure every one of us moves forward with clear eyes." She wrote to Ellen again that same evening, asking for the formal names and dates of the other two properties, anything that could be assembled into something a federal office would recognize as worth its full attention, rather than dismiss as a local dispute beneath its concern. The trouble arrived faster than even Margaret's caution had prepared her to expect. 3 days after Ellen's letter, word reached the ranch through a passing neighbor that Sheriff Pruitt had resigned his deputy's commission to a younger man and ridden out of Brazos Hollow entirely, headed toward Fort Worth, on business he hadn't explained to anyone who asked. Margaret understood immediately what the departure meant. Pruitt knew the pattern Ellen had documented made his own exposure considerably worse than simple bribery, tying him not to one isolated act but to a scheme spanning counties, and a man facing that kind of charge ran rather than waited to discover how badly it would land on him. His running told her something more important than his guilt confirmed. It told her Reed and Crane now understood, through whatever channel had carried the warning to Pruitt, that their method had been documented and was likely already on its way to federal attention. Men who believed they still had 30 days of legal maneuvering left didn't panic their own hired sheriff into flight. Men who understood the window had collapsed to days, not weeks, did exactly that. Walter took the news harder than Margaret expected, color draining briefly from his face before he steadied himself. If the sheriff's running, that means the men paying him understand something's coming faster than we'd planned for. Which means they'll move faster too. It means precisely that, Margaret agreed, and didn't soften it, because Walter had earned the truth delivered plainly by now, weeks past the point where she'd worried about protecting him from understanding his own danger clearly. It was that same evening that Daniel found Miguel at the base of the eastern rise, conscious but disoriented, a gash along his temple where he'd been struck from behind before he'd had any chance to see who'd done it. Margaret reached him minutes later, pressing a cloth against the wound, with hands that had gone steady through long practice, and felt something cold settle into her chest even as her hands continued their careful, methodical work. 2 of them, Miguel managed. Words slow and slurred at the edges came up from behind. Didn't hear them till it was already too late to matter. Terence arrived moments after, lantern in hand, his usually impassive face carrying something darker than Margaret had seen from him before. He crouched beside Miguel, checking the wound with the rough competence of a man who'd patched up injuries before in places that hadn't offered much in the way of proper doctoring. "He'll mend," Terence said, finally, the words carrying relief and anger in equal measure. Whoever did this meant to scare, not kill. That's something, but it isn't much. This wasn't reconnaissance any longer. Reconnaissance didn't strike a man down in the dark and leave him bleeding at his post. This was the opening move of something that intended to finish considerably more violently than anything that had come before it. And it had arrived not on the 30th day of Reed's deadline, but on what Margaret now calculated, working backward, was closer to the 18th. "They're not waiting out the window," she said, more to herself than to Walter, though he heard it plainly enough standing beside her in the lantern light. Pruitt running told them, "Their exposure's already gone past what patience can fix. They know the pattern's been documented. The only move left that still serves them is taking this land before that documentation reaches anyone with the power to stop them." "How long do we have?" Walter asked, and his voice carried less fear in it than she expected, something closer to the hard, settled calm of a man who'd finally stopped waiting for the danger and simply met it. She looked toward the north road, dark and empty, and somehow, in that moment, more threatening for its emptiness than any visible danger could have been. "I don't think we have until morning." The household moved through the remaining hours of that night with the quiet efficiency of people who had, without quite realizing it, already rehearsed for exactly this. Daniel checked the wire line at the creek bed twice, tightening a slack section near the second bell. Terence climbed to the barn loft with a fresh box of cartridges and the particular focus of a man settling in for however long the waiting required. Margaret walked the yard once more in the dark, the same careful study she'd given it her first night here. Weeks ago now, though everything about how she moved through it had changed in the time since. The uncertain newcomer, replaced by someone who understood every angle of this ground, as thoroughly she'd so understood the ground of her childhood. The riders came 2 hours before dawn, while cloud cover still sat thick enough to swallow most of the moon's light, and Margaret heard them before she saw them, the particular rhythm of multiple horses, moving with the deliberate spacing of men who had planned this approach rather than stumbled into it by accident. She was already in the yard, Walter beside her, with the Winchester she'd taught him to hold steady. 3 weeks earlier, Terence positioned in the barn loft, with the clear line she'd helped him build. Daniel near the creek bed where the wire and the copper bells waited for exactly this moment to prove their worth. 9 shapes resolved out of the dark along the main road, slow and spread wide, and Margaret felt every old instinct her father had carved into her rise up at once, cataloging spacing and approach angles with a clarity that surprised her, even as it steadied her hands at her sides. The first bell rang from the creek bed, soft and bright in the dark, and a horse stumbled somewhere beyond the wire, a rider cursing low under his breath. Daniel, crouched near the second line, watched 2 riders pull up hard, confusion plain even at this distance in how their horses circled and fought the unfamiliar resistance tangling at their legs. His hands shook slightly around the rifle. Terence had drilled him on, but his breathing stayed even, the discipline of weeks of practice holding through the moment it actually mattered. From the barn roof, a single shot cracked off the limestone ridge behind the riders, fired deliberately over their heads, a warning rather than an attack. And the 2 shapes attempting the western approach pulled up hard, horses shying at a danger they couldn't yet locate or name. For one suspended moment, Margaret genuinely didn't know which way the night would break. 9 riders against a household of 5, however well prepared, remained 9 riders, and the cold mathematics of that fact sat plainly in her chest, even as she stepped forward rather than back, because retreat now would only invite a second attempt with less warning behind it. A voice came from the back of the formation, hard and commanding, and Margaret recognized it immediately as Silas Tate's, though something in its tone tonight carried less of the practiced courtesy from his daylight visit and more of a man operating under different orders than the ones he'd arrived with the first time. She stepped forward into the open yard, alone, unarmed by deliberate choice, and felt Walter's sharp intake of breath behind her, the fear of a man watching someone he'd grown to depend on walk directly into danger he couldn't follow her into. "Margaret." The word came out tight, more plea than protest. "Stay where you are," she said, not turning, her voice carrying the same evenness it had carried through every difficult conversation of the past 3 weeks, though beneath it, where Walter couldn't see, her pulse ran considerably faster than her voice let on. "I know this man. I need him to remember that he knows me too, before anyone here does something that can't be taken back. The riders had slowed at the sight of a single figure standing, exposed in the open yard, confusion rippling through men, braced for resistance who hadn't planned for this. Tate's horse came forward from the formation, slow, and in the thin gray light, just beginning to soften the eastern sky, Margaret could finally see his face clearly enough to confirm what some buried part of her had suspected. Since the boot prints on the rise weeks earlier, since the scar along his jaw, since the loose, trusting way he held his reins, Silas Tate, she said, and watched something flicker across his face at the sound of his own name, spoken with that particular weight behind it. 12 years ago, you stood in front of my husband's bench charged with stealing a horse. The formation behind him had gone still. Confusion rippling through riders who hadn't expected their foreman to be addressed like a man with a history, rather than simply an obstacle standing in their path. That horse died on the road, Tate said, and his voice had changed entirely now. The hardness gone out of it, replaced by something raw and unguarded that hadn't surfaced in years by the sound of it. My brother had a fever. I needed to get him to a doctor faster than my own legs could carry him. You told the court exactly that, Margaret said, and Joseph believed you, sentenced you to labor instead of the rope half that courtroom wanted for you. And after the verdict, when everyone else had filed out, he came down off the bench and said something to you privately. I was standing close enough to hear it, though I don't think you ever knew that. Not in all the years since. Tate's jaw worked, and for the first time since he'd arrived at her gate weeks earlier, something other than calculation moved openly across his face. He said he believed a man might do wrong out of desperation. Margaret continued, the words arriving from a memory she'd finally, fully reached in the days since the fragment first surfaced, sharpened now by the scar and the rains and every small piece that had built toward this exact moment, but that he didn't believe that same man would always choose wrong, given the chance to choose otherwise. He said, don't make me wrong about you. The silence that followed stretched long enough that one of the horses behind Tate shifted and snorted, restless in the growing light, and Margaret stood in that silence without moving, without softening, letting the weight of the memory do work that no weapon in her hands could have managed in its place. He's been dead 18 months, Tate said finally, and his voice carried something close to grief now, unexpected and entirely real. I didn't know. He spent his whole life believing people deserved the chance to prove him right, Margaret said. I've spent the 18 months since trying to honor what that belief cost him and gave him an equal measure. Tonight, you have exactly the choice he gave you 12 years ago. You can choose wrong again, with considerably less excuse than desperation behind it this time. Or you can finally, after all these years, make him right. Tate sat his horse a long, suspended moment, the formation behind him waiting on a decision none of them fully understood the weight of, and then, slowly, he raised one hand, the signal for riders to hold their positions, and turned his mount to face the men he'd led there. Stand down, he said, his voice carrying clear across the yard. This is finished. A voice from the formation protested, something about Crane's orders, about payment already promised and owed. Tate's response came hard and final. Cutting it off mid-sentence, I said, stand down. Anyone who rides forward does it without me beside them. And you'll explain to Crane yourselves why his foreman walked away from this. The formation broke slowly. Riders exchanging glances in the strengthening light, and one by one they turned their horses back toward the north road, the retreat of men who had arrived for one kind of fight, and found themselves, instead, witnesses to something they hadn't been prepared to understand and explain afterward. Tate remained a moment longer, looking at Margaret across the empty yard with an expression carrying equal parts shame and something like gratitude, the look of a man handed unexpectedly, and after 12 years, the exact chance to choose differently that he'd believed long closed to him. Tell whoever asks that I'm finished working for Crane, he said. But this isn't over for you, Margaret. Crane's not a man who absorbs a loss quietly, and what happened here tonight, with witnesses watching me turn against my own riders, he'll treat as a wound to his standing in this county that he can't simply let sit unanswered. I don't know what he does next. I only know it won't be nothing. He turned his horse and rode after the others, not toward Crane's land, but toward open country beyond it, and Margaret watched him go until the growing dawn light swallowed his shape entirely. the warning he'd left behind sitting heavier in her chest than the relief of the rider's retreat had any right to allow. Walter reached her a moment later, the Winchester lowered now, his face carrying a wonder that hadn't fully caught up to what he'd just witnessed. "You knew him this whole time?" "I knew a fragment of him," Margaret said. "It took until tonight to remember the rest of it clearly enough to use." She looked toward the North Road, empty now, and then toward the eastern sky, where dawn continued its slow arrival, regardless of anything that had just happened beneath it. "He's right that this isn't finished, Walter. Crane doesn't lose a night like tonight and simply accept it. We need Ellen's documentation in federal hands faster than we'd planned, before Crane decides his next move costs him less than waiting does." The letter went out that same morning, carrying everything Margaret had assembled across the preceding weeks. Finch's signed confession with its detail of Pruitt's January Sunday, Ellen's documentation of the three-county pattern, and a careful account in Margaret's own hand of the night's events and Tate's warning about what might follow them. The federal investigator arrived from Austin 6 days later, faster than Margaret had dared hope, a compact, precise man named Garrett Sumner who had, it emerged, already been building a case against the Fort Worth Consortium for 3 months before Ellen's earlier correspondence gave him cause to move with new urgency. He spent 2 full days at the ranch before moving on, interviewing each member of the household separately with the methodical patience of a man who'd learned that the small inconsistencies between accounts mattered less than the consistent details that survived every retelling. He spoke longest with Margaret, the two of them at the kitchen table for the better part of an afternoon, while she walked him through everything she'd assembled, the documents and the timeline and the careful logic connecting Finch's confession to Pruitt's flight, to the pattern Ellen had uncovered. Sumner listened with the particular attention of a man accustomed to people either exaggerating their evidence or underselling it, and seemed, by the end of the conversation, satisfied that Margaret had done neither. "In 15 years doing this work," he said, gathering his papers, "I've rarely seen a private citizen assemble a case this clean without legal training behind it." "I had legal training," Margaret said, "just not the kind that comes with a license to practice it. 30 years married to a county judge teaches a person a great deal, whether anyone intended it to or not." Sumner's investigation, once fully assembled, revealed a scope larger than even Margaret had suspected reading Ellen's letter days earlier. Wendell Crane's name appeared throughout the consortium's internal correspondence, financing arrangements stretching back nearly a decade, the same patient method applied to vulnerable landholders across half the state. Marcus Reed's career, examined closely, showed a trail of similarly timed amendments filed against similarly weakened men, 3 confirmed cases beyond Walter's own, with 2 further under active suspicion that Sumner intended to pursue regardless of how long it took. Crane himself never appeared at the ranch, never stood in the yard to answer for any of it directly. Margaret understood, reading the federal charges filed against him weeks later, that this was simply how men like Crane operated, building their fortunes from a careful distance and falling, when they finally fell, the same way, through paper and proxy, rather than any direct confrontation that might have given the people he'd wronged the satisfaction of facing him across a table the water right held. Ellen's documentation, combined with Finch's confession and Sumner's broader findings, dissolved the February amendment entirely, restoring the Coombs' claim to exactly the standing it had held before illness. And absence had made it look vulnerable to men who specialized in exploiting exactly that appearance of weakness. Margaret stayed at the ranch longer than the original arrangement had specified, the $15 a month long, since stopped mattering to either of them as the precise measure of why she remained. Walter's health continued its slow improvement through the following weeks, color returning fully to his face, the cane growing less necessary by the day, though he kept it near out of habit more than need. They sat on the porch most evenings now, the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had survived something together, and found, on the other side of it, that the silence between them had become a different kind of company than it had been before any of this began. Daniel had taken to joining them some evenings, sitting on the porch steps below, no longer the boy who'd carried his mistake like a stone in his chest, but something closer to a young man, Nang's footing under the steady example he'd watched all spring. "You could stay on," Walter said one evening, the words arriving carefully, a man choosing each one with more deliberation than the sentence's length seemed to require. "Not as hired help. I mean that, Margaret. I mean something closer to what you've already become to this place, and to me, if you'd let yourself consider it." Margaret looked out over the valley, the limestone ridges going soft gold in the last of the evening light. The same view she'd studied with a careful eye weeks earlier, and now simply watched. For the first time since arriving, the way a person watches something beautiful rather than something requiring vigilance. "Joseph used to say some debts get repaid in strange currency," she said. "I think I understand now what currency mine got repaid in." She turned to look at him. Something easing in her chest that she hadn't fully realized was still tight until the moment it loosened. "I'd like to stay, Walter. Not because the danger's gone, though I'm grateful it is. Because I find I'd rather watch this particular light fall over this particular valley than go back to a room above a dry goods store and call that living." Walter's hand found hers on the porch rail, careful, tentative, and Margaret let her fingers close around his without hurrying the moment toward anything more than what it already quietly was. Inside the house, a single lamp burned steady in the front window, left on now for no reason beyond the comfort of it being there. There's a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself with noise. It doesn't ride in fast or raise its voice to be heard. It sits quietly in a courtroom for 30 years, listening, learning the shape of a lie before it finishes forming, and it waits, sometimes for decades, for the moment it's actually needed. Margaret Hollis didn't win that night in the yard because she was faster than 9 armed riders, or because she carried a weapon capable of matching theirs. She won because, once said to a frightened, desperate young man, and she trusted that a kindness given freely 12 years earlier could still matter, could still reach across all that time and change what happened next. That's worth sitting with for a moment. How many of us carry a debt like that without knowing it? A kindness someone showed us once when we didn't deserve it, that we've never fully repaid because we never got the chance, or never recognized the chance when it came. And how many of us are, right now, the version of Silas Tate, standing at some crossroads of our own, waiting on someone to remind us who we actually decided to be, somewhere back along the road, before fear or anger or simple momentum carries us somewhere else. Think about Joseph Hollis for a moment, a man we never met directly in this story, a man who'd already been gone 18 months before any of these events unfolded. He never lived to see that courtroom moment matter the way it did. He never knew his quiet faith in a desperate young man would, 12 years later, save the life of the woman he loved and the friend he never got to meet. But that's how it works. More often than we notice, the good we do rarely announces its return on the same day we do it. Sometimes it takes a decade. Sometimes it takes longer than that. But it has a way of finding its way back if we're patient enough and humble enough to recognize it when it finally arrives, often in a shape we never would have predicted when we first did the kindness that planted it. There's something else worth carrying away from this. Something about the particular nature of the courage Margaret had showed that night. She didn't fight with violence. She fought with memory, with patience, with the simple, stubborn belief that most people, even the ones who've made themselves into instruments of someone else's greed, still carry somewhere inside them the capacity to choose differently. That belief is harder to hold on to than any weapon. It asks more of a person because it requires you to risk being wrong, to risk that the person standing in front of you really has hardened past the point of reaching. But it's also, in the end, the only kind of strength that actually changes anything lasting. A bullet stops a man for a moment. A reminder of who he once decided to be can stop him for the rest of his life. Tate didn't just retreat that night. He chose, finally and fully, who he wanted to be, and that choice will outlast every other thing that happened in that yard, long after the memory of 9 riders and 1 unarmed woman has faded into something closer to legend than fact. And consider, too, what this story says about the particular value of a spent paying attention. Margaret wasn't extraordinary because of any single dramatic skill. She was extraordinary because she'd spent 30 years cultivating the habit of noticing of listening past what people said to what they actually meant, of sitting with difficult things until their true shape emerged. That's not a gift reserved for the young or the strong or the conventionally powerful. It's available to anyone willing to slow down enough to practice it. In a world that often measures worth by speed and force, there's something quietly radical about a 64-year-old widow proving, in the space of one long night, that attention and patience can outmatch 9 armed men. So here's the question worth taking with you long after this story's done. Who's the person in your life you might be misjudging too quickly, simply because you've only seen the hardest version of them, the version shaped by fear or circumstance or bad choices made under pressure? And what would it cost you, really, to remember instead the better version, the one capable of still choosing right, given half a reason and a little patience to wait for it? Maybe it's a family member who disappointed you once and never quite earned back your full trust. Maybe it's a stranger you wrote off after a single bad encounter. Maybe it's even a version of yourself you've stopped believing in. If this story found something true in you tonight, I'd love to hear it. Has someone's quiet faith in you once changed the direction your life was headed? Or have you ever been the one extending that faith to someone else, not knowing if it would ever be returned? Tell me in the comments below. I read everyone, and I suspect there are more stories like Margaret's and Tate's sitting quietly in the lives of the people reading this than any of us realize.